Eye of the Beholder from Metallica, a song about censorship from And Justice for All in 1988, and relevant more than ever in these current times that we're in. All right, so this is the day two podcast following the Republican National Convention, which took place last night in Washington, D.C., and a live broadcast with President Trump and a rather grandiose display of fireworks and opera music, and a pretty patriotic showing that unfortunately both created a diversion but also created some chaos outside of the White House, where there were more peaceful protests and effigies of Trump on a guillotine and a few other things I saw in the news, and we'll get to some of that. But let's go over some of the highlights of the RNC last night. We had a opening prayer from Franklin Graham, son of the late Reverend Billy Graham, and Secretary of Housing and Urban Development Ben Carson, who focused on the importance of pride and self-confidence and showing, your willingness to succeed in the face of adversity, and some really important thoughts about his mother and what she encouraged him to do, and his faith in scripture, and what motivated him both as a pediatric neurosurgeon and to run for president, and now become the Secretary of Housing and Urban Development, a good friend of Trump's from all indications. We saw from Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell, who's running a pretty ambitious race in Kentucky. McConnell's been in the Congress for like 34 years now, since 1986. Now he's going up against Amy McGrath, who's been a congressional candidate back in 2018. She's a former fighter pilot. McGrath took a little bit of flubbing from Democrats for being a pro-Trump Democrat. She took considerable flubbing from the Republicans for her stand against Brett Kavanaugh when he was being sworn in, against allegations from Christine Blasey Ford. And I think there's been a little bit of, hopelessness there. So let's say McConnell will probably secure that seat. Another senator who's going to be up for re-election is Arkansas Senator Tom Cotton. Cotton took a really strong anti-Biden approach last night, which is not uncommon for Tom Cotton. He says China's rooting for Joe Biden. He also said that former Secretary of Defense Robert Gates in the Obama administration had said, quote, Barack Obama's own Secretary of Defense said Joe Biden's been wrong on nearly every major national security decision over the past 4 years. And that's something that's been played over and over again on some conservative news outlets. Fox News has shown that quote several times. We heard from House Republican leader Kevin McCarthy from California, Representative Jeff Van Drew from New Jersey, who was a Democrat until recently, and after being pushed and prodded, and as he put it, made to feel uncomfortable with Nancy Pelosi, decided to join the Republicans and support Trump. Ivanka Trump, the president's older daughter, who announced him and came out and gave a pretty good 20-plus minute speech. Jaron Smith, assistant to the president, African-American gentleman who's making a big headway in politics, and who did advocate, saying that Trump is for the black community. We heard from Ann Dorn, Officer David Dorn, retired police captain who was tragically murdered and live streamed on Facebook back in St. Louis in June. His wife spoke, and she made a pretty good case for Donald Trump. We heard from Debbie Flood, former New York City Mayor Rudy Giuliani, who is the law and order advocate, Trump's lawyer, and a pretty successful prosecutor in his time, going against taking on and bringing down a large swath of the mafia in New York City. We heard from Alice Johnson, a black woman who was released from prison due to a nonviolent drug offense. She was put in prison in 1996, and she was released in 2018 by Trump after making an appeal for her. And it was a pretty convincing case. Wade Mayfield spoke. We heard from Carl and Marcia Mueller, the parents of a kidnapped ISIS torture victim. Their daughter was killed, held captive, raped repeatedly by al-Baghdadi, and this was all during the Obama administration. They made a pretty plausible case against Joe Biden, refusing to negotiate with terrorists, refusing to do anything that would create waves. And it was really, really touching to hear the parents' testimony, and it was really heartbreaking to see what they went through. They made a case that if Trump had been president at the time of their daughter's kidnapping, she probably would have been here today. So that was pretty moving stuff. We also heard from Dana White, CEO of the UFC, and he made a pretty political case about Trump, no-nonsense 4 or 5 minute speech that really, really spoke to his base and probably a lot of other people that may not necessarily follow politics. And so it was a pretty moving ceremony. Trump came out. He gave the longest acceptance speech in the history of conventions. It was 71 minutes long. He touched on a few things. He kind of verged into campaign rally territory a few times, adding a few ad-lib remarks that were not on the teleprompter. But overall, it was a really comprehensive speech. It was a good speech. He talked about the victims of Hurricane Laura down in the Gulf Coast. He talked about COVID. He talked about the response to COVID. And he also talked about social unrest, social justice. Trump came out and said that he's done more for Black Americans than any president since Abraham Lincoln, and whether you agree with that or not, there is truth to the fact that he has funded a lot of African American colleges. He has worked for social justice reform. He has met with members of the Black community, and he's tried to kind of get his message out that to counteract Biden, you ain't Black. If you're not voting for me, it's not necessarily the case. And so on that note, we came into this morning, which was the 57th anniversary of the March on Washington, which was a civil rights, historical moment featuring A. Philip Randolph, Martin Luther King Jr., John Lewis, who was a 23-year-old, college student at the time, and Reverend Eugene Carson Blake of the National Council of Churches. It was historical to note that both conservative and liberal media outlets all were telling the story at the same time this morning. And one of the things that I found really, really intriguing was that the speakers were talking about, racial injustice, getting out and voting. And it was called to mind that John F. Kennedy and his brother Bobby Kennedy were actually opposed to letting the leaders talk in Washington. They were afraid that it was going to create riots. They were afraid that it was going to create violence, and that they were, in some way, kind of afraid of letting their voices be heard because they didn't think that it would necessarily resonate with their political message. Reverend Blake didn't like references to revolution and black masses, and he actually called that communist talk, and that was some of the things that the other speakers were alluding to, and he wanted to make a distinction that he was about peaceful protests and that being heard. They did, however, have the last word, and history notes the groundbreaking speech they made that day. The
fail to deliver in this moment and grasp what they fought for. God bless you. Let's go. Let's get this done. We're able. We're powerful. Use the UR code that's on the screen.